Ladies and gentlemen, we are live as this is the main event you've all been waiting for. Brought to you by Exonius, the cybersecurity asset management company. It's time!
Hey, Cloud Security Podcast, Steve from Bridge Crew here. Check us out to start scanning your infrastructure as code against hundreds of security policies, both on the command line and in your IDE. Bridge Crew also adds security feedback to all your commits and helps you fix misconfigurations in both code and runtime.
Hey, welcome to another episode of Virtual Coffee with Ashish. I think, as you can see, I was juggling between trying to get my videos working, but I'm finally got there. But for people who are celebrating Onam, which is a festival from southern part of India, which I celebrated yesterday. Happy Onam. And yeah, I think I just wanted to call it out because I think I haven't really spoken about it before. I've tweeted about it, but I've never spoken about it. So happy Onam for everyone. And I'm looking forward to today's episode because a lot of people have asked me about Monolith. What is Monolith and what do we do when we're trying to move them across? What do you think about security? So I've got someone special here for that. And let me just tune in the perfect music and put the banners up before I bring the gentleman in. So, hey, John, welcome, man. How are you going?
Ashish, good to see you. Great to be here.
Okay, good to see you as well. And we've got a few people coming in as well. Hey, Vineet. I've got this thing where, I obviously want to get into the description, but I've got a coffee, and I hope you have your drink as well, man. Cheers. Thanks for coming in.
Today. Cheers. Happy Saturday. I hope everyone's doing well and staying safe.
Yeah, I hope so as well. Like, especially when you're considering you're close to the fires as well. So especially the folks who are around the fire, I hope you feel you guys are all right. Happy Onam to you as well, Vineet. Yes, feast was good, man. We ate a lot. Thanks. So I'm going to, obviously, I don't want to screw up your introduction. So I would love to know and introduce you to my audience as well. So who is John Kinsella?
Who is John? My name is John. My favorite color is blue. I try to keep these short, dude. What's the short version? I've been in AppSec and cloud and operations for the last 20 years. Done a few startups. I was in Silicon Valley. I'm a San Francisco native. I was in Silicon Valley until about a year and a half ago. Moved up to Seattle. My specialty the last 5-10 years is really around cloud security, container security. I was co-founder of a company called Layered Insight, where we were doing runtime security, acquired by Qualys. I've sort of live, breathe, eat in this space. Part of Cloud Security Alliance. I've done security work with Apache Software Foundation. I'm now more active with security technical advisory group for both Kubernetes and for Cloud Native Computing Foundation, if I can talk.
Mouthful there.
So lots of open source stuff, lots of security stuff, and I'm able to do applications in startups as well. So sort of a pretty big thing to cover, but I'm still a simple guy, and I'm happy to talk about all this stuff.
And I think that's why I was looking forward to having you here to talk about something which is probably not spoken about enough online, which is the conversation about Monolith, which we're all talking about Kubernetes. We're all talking about what the future is going to be. But people have forgotten about the, 30, 40 years of programming that we've been doing. And it's like suddenly people are like, hey, do we want to leave them behind or bring them with us? So maybe to start off with, what do you define as cloud native?
Yeah. It's funny, when we were talking in the pre-show, I actually had to go and Google, okay, what do other people think it is? But I've sort of let that sit through my head now. And really, to me, what cloud native is building something that's scalable and modern. I'm just going to box it really tight and say that. I think anyone who's getting into software development nowadays, either professional sort of hacking around, they're going to be playing with, more modern languages like JavaScript and TypeScript and Go and I'm going to leave it out and like someone feel bad, but more modern languages. They're going to be using more modern tools with those, CI/CD, continuous integration, being able to deploy those out. They're going to deploy to that. Oh, wait for it, it's coming to the cloud. And that's sort of the very high level. But I think if we actually think about a little more detail what that means, I'll bring in saying things. It's something which is nimble, scalable, I'd say distributed. So those are sort of some of the categoristics. Wow, I will start to be able to talk here at some point. I've done this before, but those are some of the characteristics I think of and some of the adjectives it's used. It's sort of a, I'll try not to use too many cloud jokes, but sort of a nebulous thing. But that's sort of the structure around of how I think of it.
And I'm so glad you kind of touched on distributed and nebulous as well. I'm like, wait, are these things that are in Monolith? I don't think these things exist in Monolith. So
No.
how do you define Monolith? I think it's for people, because people may be even wondering, what is Monolith? Why do I even care? Because clearly Kubernetes is the future.
It is, right? But you have to remember, like I said, I was doing containers and layered inside before. When I lived in San Francisco, I was 6 blocks away from Docker's headquarters. So I used to go over there all the time. And I really lived in a bubble in Silicon Valley of all these buzzwords and crazy things. But if you go 100, 150 miles outside, people still have applications that were written over the last 10, 20 years, which are trying to support. So if I had to put into a single word what I think of as monolithic, it's sort of actually, as I think about it, it's sort of an antecedent. That's how we started. So whereas I'd say cloud native is modern, really a monolith is more legacy. But I'm sure people could still write. Well, they definitely could still write this stuff today. But so what does a monolithic mean in my mind? Usually bigger, a bigger code base. And you can have a bunch of microservices in one Git repo. So that's not a clear definition by itself. But I'd say where it really comes down, if you've got an application that's doing a bunch of different things. So think about like a shopping cart. If it's not doing something modern and neat and clean, where you're, a modern shopping cart, these are products I want to buy. Here's my shipping address and here's my credit card number, go, right? The catalog and the web display is separate. And what's interesting is I sort of scribbling some notes and thinking about this chat today. The UI might not be any different between those two things we just talked about, right? You still might have a shopping cart, you might have whatever it is, but how those pieces move behind the scenes is the exciting point, but also I think what differentiates those two things.
Oh, actually, that's true, because it's not that. I mean, I guess you can put a lipstick on with the new website and go whatever you want to do, I guess, and it looks very fancy. But at the back end, it's still maybe running on mainframe, or I don't know, something even more. I don't know what's ancient than mainframe, which is still running. But probably that's one thing that I think of.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, I've actually in this room, I've got my first computer ever, a VIC-20. So even that's still not as old as the mainframes, right? The I series and the Z series go back into the 70s. I've got to work on them before; they're pretty cool. But to finish, I started interrupting myself there on the shopping cart example. So if we go legacy, I don't know, let's pick, how about a auto supply store? So within that shopping cart, they'd have all their inventory system. There are ERP systems like what's on all our shelves, what have we ordered, what's coming in. I have to be able to do credit card processing. I have to be able to do shipping. I have to be able to do the display of the product in the web interface or whatever it is, and be able to say what's out of stock. But that's all one code base. So if we want to talk about that versus how you go to microservices, you have, and a lot of this starts becoming outsourced, right? So you could be using Shopify for the actual cart and checkout. ERP is probably going to be a completely different system, right? Especially if you're bigger, it's going to be an Oracle or something. What else? Your web interface is going to be light and nimble and something written in JavaScript, not PHP or an ultra language. But all these are little separate pieces, and you can adjust each one individually without having to recompile and redeploy the whole thing.
Oh, actually, that's good, because that was the next question that I was going to ask. Like, when people do move Monolith to cloud, I guess in my mind, Monolith is probably millions of lines of code. People have been writing them for years, maybe in a language which is not even supported anymore. And it's a version probably which is 10, 15 versions behind the actual version.
Yeah.
I'm like, and I don't even, it's funny, every time someone talks about they're working on PHP now, and I'm going, wow, PHP. Or you almost go like, wow, this is gonna be, I don't know how but apparently there's still applications out there. Even Facebook started on PHP, and they still use PHP.
Yeah, well, what the PHP which Facebook has is a pretty special beast nowadays, right? I think that's a pretty strong fork. It's actually compiled. It's not an interpret language anymore. There's at least one large security company out there that's still a lot of their web interface is PHP. I won't name names to shame people, but it's hard, right? It's because I didn't talk. One of the hats I wear is I'm a host on Application Security Weekly. So slightly different market set than what you are, and hopefully we can share some guests back and forth with listeners. But thinking about, if I put my manager hat on, like nowadays I'm a co-founder and CTO of a startup, my focus is to, keep both my CEO happy so he has something he can show to VCs and to customers, and keep my customers happy, right? So that's really sort of the focus around what I'm trying to do. But what you didn't hear me say there is I've got a ton of time to go back and rewrite something which works in a new language. So we start doing a balancing thing here, right? And that's sort of the always the problem in that we start talking through is we want to be able to have something secure, we want to have something scalable, but at the same time, ain't nobody going to rewrite the whole thing. So how do we find this balance is sort of
So someone has to spend money on it, someone has to spend the time on it. So the balance between, hey, should we release new features or should we go back and change this monolith into like a microservices, I guess decoupled world of microservices? It's just I've got a comment here from Zenith as well. All of that about cloud native plus architecture built around microservices. It just there is so much around the cloud native architecture thing that we can kind of deep dive into. But I kind of wanted to kind of speak. Have you, I guess, share some challenges that you think people would face when, so they're moving a monolith to a microservices from a security perspective? And we're not even talking about cloud at the moment, just like moving from monolith to a microservice. What kind of challenges do you reckon people can expect? I mean, just top three that came to your mind.
Yeah. You know what the big one is, which I think is really interesting, especially probably to partial of your audience, is we're going from, if you think about how you secure a monolith, right? You've got usually a large number of developers, and security is probably on another floor somewhere completely different building. And they're usually thinking about firewalls and intrusion detection and WAFs and antivirus and really sort of more IT security or enterprise security. As you start breaking these things down from that monolith into a microservices, and we can talk about how people go through that, this becomes an application security game. Right. So if you think about cloud security, a lot of cloud security is application security, right? Before I got into cloud security, I was doing a lot of penetration testing and code review and stuff like that. So AppSec. And then this cloud thing came along. I'm like, hey, this is sort of cool. I want to go do that. But besides just a pure AppSec thing, thinking about multi-tenancy, what used to be a single, if we think about a monolith deployed into cloud, maybe it's on EC2 instances or GCP, I'm going to get in trouble, whatever they call their virtual servers or their Azure equivalent, or the smaller guys. I try to give everyone, fair chance. But as those go into a more microservice type environment, you start getting the chance of multi-tenancy. So maybe someone thinks, hey, we're going to go to Kubernetes and put everything in that, and then, everything's going to be great. But now you might have containers from the marketing department mixed with containers from billing and finance, and I'll let you guess which one of those two is probably going to be more secure. So do you want those in the same tenant? No, so you have to start dealing with things like that and thinking about things. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot. I mean, even just talking through what we've talked so far, right? I've said things around CI/CD and, some of these other sort of concepts, but like as you actually start to move and deploy some of these things, the amount of stuff you've got going on is just, it's impossible to really keep track. It's sort of crazy. So I think that's probably one of the bigger things is just for the security people to, we'll probably talk here a few times about visibility and communication as we go through this, but really just keeping track of what the devs are doing, what tools are they using, what languages are they using? Because, as we go towards a microservice, one guy, like at my startup right now, I've got one founder that's writing in Python, I'm writing in Go, but since we're both writing to serverless Lambdas, it doesn't matter as long as we've got an API going back and forth. So, that's now two languages which security has to think about.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of moving pieces.
Oh, wow. So you've raised a few good things there then. So obviously the mix of languages and the mixing of architecture as well. Now suddenly you have everyone, I guess, coming from a monolith world. Oh, actually, it's worthwhile calling out. A lot of people, this is probably showing people our age, I guess. People would be working in waterfall to agile in microservices. I don't know if you can do waterfall in microservices. I don't think you can do, but I'm sure people would have figured it out that I'm going to do a Vagile, as people call it. It's a waterfall and agile combined. so that maybe that is that people are doing, where we still want to report at the end of what we're going to achieve, but I want it to be sprints and whatever you want to call it. But you almost go, so the three things I took away from that was one, obviously the mix of architecture, where suddenly you don't have a dedicated server for database or one server for database. application, web application, or you could really have 3 different servers, but each one gets a container. Marketing gets a container, engineering gets a container, but they could be combined, or maybe in a cloud native kind of state as well, as you were saying earlier. And then the other challenge you mentioned about the challenge of languages. How many languages? Because freedom is not a bad thing. Like, I think allowing people to work in, like, hey, if you code faster in Go, you should code in Go. It shouldn't really matter to the interface, which is kind of what the promise of APIs was as well. Like with microservices, it shouldn't really matter. Like I could be writing in, I don't know, I'm just going to make up, like, or maybe .NET, I'm writing in .NET, and you're writing in Go. We should still be able to communicate without you trying to understand the complexity behind .NET. So, but that means from a security perspective, I need to be, I guess, an API expert, a multiple language expert, if I bring back to your AppSec first conversation as well. And I guess the third thing probably you mentioned is depending on the architecture, how it's moved across as well. Like if you move like for like, I imagine that would come in a bit more, it would make it more complicated. You kind of have to have microservices which have the decoupled model as well, because I can't imagine it working well if it is not decoupled.
Everything should be fairly loosely coupled, yeah. And that makes some aspects of this more difficult, even not just for security people, but for developers, right? If I have to do, it's one thing if you know that set of components. I like to use the phrase puzzle pieces, but if you know what they are and they're pretty tightly coupled, testing with them, doing unit tests or integration tests, is pretty simple. But as you start making them a little more loosely coupled, you're depending more upon your interfaces. So you have to have more structure in some of those interfaces and APIs and things you're putting together. So the result's great, right? Because let's think about for a second scalability. So say the monolithic app. You've got for some reason, a bunch of people are, it's before Christmas and a bunch of people want to check out, right? So they're going to be hitting that cart a ton. But the last thing you're going to be doing at the same time probably is bringing new inventory in, right? If you don't have that inventory for a retail company, if you don't have an inventory by September, October, you're not getting it for Christmas, right? So they're going to be slowing down on inventory tracking and stuff like that, but that code's still there. If you're more microservice-like, you could just, scale up the cart containers. And let them do their thing and still have 2 or 3 ERPs, to use that example. So it allows you to be more flexible in that type of way as a result, and that's sort of the benefit of it.
Actually, that's true, because not all the components of your code would need to always be updating or just refreshing, I guess. Because, I guess that's why it's a monolith, because you can still have 25 years old code, which doesn't need to move or updated. It just gets left behind, and you just keep adding on top of it. Like, I guess almost like different layers of a cake, I guess. But you just always focus on the top layer. So that makes me go then, okay, so we spoke about monolith to microservices, but monolith to like a cloud native, breaking it down. So I imagine there are similar challenges at that point then. I guess, would you say things like having multiple languages being used is slowly becoming a challenge then, I guess, then for security, even if it's in cloud native space, or are the challenges different if you've moved from monolith to, we're going to break this application into a Kubernetes or a serverless application? I can't even imagine like what would happen in that way. So application security, definitely a big challenge, but I'm keen to know from your side, what would you think of 3 things at that point from a security perspective?
Yeah, it's we'll keep repeating ourselves here. The benefits to this is huge. Getting there can be. This isn't simple. We're spending an hour sort of ripping through all these sort of topics. One thing I want to throw into your show notes, and we'll probably talk about towards the end. Adrian Cockcroft, man, the dude's been through so much stuff. He was at Sun. I think he was one of the core people behind Java. He went over to Netflix. He was I think if not CTO, chief architect, cloud architect. So he sort of brought Netflix to the cloud. About 10 years ago, he did a talk. It's like an hour 15, hour 20, depending which version of this you get, just about how you take a microservice and sort of peel off pieces slowly and turn those pieces into microservices. And that's how you get from this monolith to the microservice architecture. So he talked about an hour just for that by itself, and we're sort of going right through here. So let's see what we can do. But if we taught about 3 things in a public cloud, obviously I don't want to expose Kubernetes or whatever you're having out to the public interface. I think one of the big things to me is to not reinvent wheels. So what do I mean by that? I don't want people to go through and start creating their own load balancers. I mean, if we think about this back in enterprise day, people probably are going to be creating their own firewalls or IDSs. They're going to be buying the boxes, right? Sort of Silicon Valley style. But you have to have the box. And once we go to the cloud, the box goes away. But what I've seen is people start creating that thing themselves. So either building their own Kubernetes clusters, or building, Nginx for a load balancer, or one of the open source WAFs out there. There's a bunch of different ones. Really, my point here is, unless you've got a lot of time or a very specific reason to do that, use what the cloud providers have, because they're just building it with some of the brightest people in the world. It's being used by some of the largest companies, so it's probably going to handle what you're doing.
Yep.
And that, a lot of the stuff we're talking about, especially as you start changing languages, and we were just talking purely from a point of view of how would you go about rewriting, the PHP into Go or something. One of the things we completely glossed over is you're introducing bugs. There's pretty much no way you're going to rewrite that app without bringing bugs in. One of the things I've got for the news next week, there's a new vulnerability patched now. Or no, they're still working on, was patched, but they're working on releasing the patch in glibc. But the fun part about this is where this came from. Someone else found another bug. I think it was in March. They patched and released that version glibc, but it turns out the patch has a vulnerability in it. They do a null pointer dereference. So it's like, this is one of those things, right? Every time you breathe or touch some of these things, even if you're, really good people. I think this guy was at, I think he was at Red Hat. So, again, great companies, but it's you got to be on your toes. So let's see. So I talked about don't reinvent the wheel. Don't expose yourself on public internet, like, exposing. One of the common issues that people were seeing with Docker and Kubernetes and security was they were leaving that port open on the internet without being firewalled. And the crypto miners really appreciate that, because they're more than willing to come in and use your resources to run their own mining. So you don't want to do that. And then let's see, if I want to throw another one out there specifically for public, is you got to start thinking about isolation more. So we talked about multi-tenancy a little bit.
Yep.
But even just how do you isolate, say, either network or compute between two containers? And then the second half of that is not just isolation, but also encryption. I was interviewing at a company 10, 15 years ago, and it was right before, right as cloud was getting big, and they're like, what would you do if you came in here? And the first thing I said is, I want VPNs between all your, at that point it was EC2 instances. Yep. And I was basically laughed out of the room. But nowadays, right, if you're in a public cloud, we've seen a few times that every now and then either a malicious user or possibly governments will get involved internally in somewhere they shouldn't be and are able to sniff traffic. It has to be encrypted. It makes the developer's life, it makes the operator's life a little more difficult for troubleshooting things if there's actually an issue going on. Yep. But we're at a point where you gotta, that trust boundary has to be very, very small.
Wow, those are interesting, because I think as you were talking about this, I also realized we kind of brushed upon something else as well, where the traditional world has always been about vulnerability management, IDS, IPSs, and moving this to cloud for a monolith. A lot of people would, and I've been asked this question, so I'm curious to know your response. Like, hey, when do I turn to a third-party app versus using something from the cloud provider? If I'm moving across, say I've already got a bunch of security products in my on-premise. I got just like throw a word, Trend Micro, antivirus, and something. Just like think of a security product that's worked in a traditional world for a long time, and now I'm ready to go to the cloud. And I'm going, actually, the obvious question that a lot of people are asking themselves is like, hey, should I continue with my third-party app, or should I buy a new third-party app? Or should I just go to cloud native, as in something provided by the cloud provider for security?
I would strongly lean towards changing. So it's funny, we talked about the boxes and all those box vendors. If you go out to like the Amazon, go talk about Amazon, just keep it simple. But if you look at the Amazon marketplace, all those box vendors, they've got the software version of that box there. Again, they're happy to sell you. But in some cases, that's fine, right? And, antivirus is probably a good example. Antivirus is antivirus. You're still looking for a pattern. You're looking for some sort of pattern against your signatures usually, and then that's how you do that. Keep in mind, if you're doing that, you're now paying a cloud service to run your antivirus software. So you got to be a little careful about when do you want to actually use it, right? That's one of the tricks there. Do you want AV on your server? It's a bit of a religious question. Yeah. But the way I think about this is, and I'm stumbling here a little bit because I come from the vendor side, not even currently, but just previous lives where I've built cloud native security tools, right? So I don't want to make it look like I'm biased here, but really at the end of the day, a tool which has been designed from the get-go for either cloud or cloud native, it does things in different ways. It thinks about scalability different. It thinks about usability, authentication, logging, debugging, all those sort of usability concepts, APIs. You're not going to see as much of those in the, well, hey, here we can go. We can call the legacy security products almost monolithic security products. Haha. So I would at least, I think it's worth a review, right? It's worth looking to see what are getting high ratings out there. What are people using? Do you have to buy a box or can you use something open source? Do you really need to be using that in public cloud? So there's a few different things around there you can think about. Another example to throw at you, if you're in a high security environment on-prem, you've probably got a few HSMs around, right? Hardware security modules to put all your keys and key management stuff in. You can now get those in the cloud, but boy, howdy, they're not cheap. And for folks who've used HSMs, know usually one have failover in case one fails. You have to have two of those bad boys, so you're really paying a lot of money. It's last I checked, it's into thousands of dollars per month, US.
Wow.
So if you need it, you need it. There's cheaper ways to do it. Then the question is, do you need the full HSM, or can you just use Amazon's security management and just put a token in there, which costs like 40 cents a month? So pretty big difference, but that's some of the things that people have to think about.
Actually, you raised an interesting point over there, because the whole benefit that was, I guess, the dream that was sold by cloud was that, hey, it's going to be cheaper, more agile, more flexible. And that's kind of, I feel like in a way, and I feel comfortable telling you this, because I feel I won't be aged out, I guess, in a way. But the interesting thing for me was when people moved to cloud, that's when microservices kind of happened. Agile methodology happened around the same time. And people still kind of forgot, hey, that's all great, but I still want to do what I was doing before, because that's what I know and that's what I'm comfortable with. So are we agreeing on the fact that that's probably not the right approach in cloud, to continue trying to recreate what we had on premise in the cloud?
So I think I did one of the earlier cloud talks I did was how do you migrate to cloud? And I think my version, I wasn't thinking about the monolith at the time, but now I think about it, probably same idea. Was, do you want to forklift that application over and put it into EC2 and continue doing your things? And there's value there, right? I mean, Amazon's got a whole division that'll happily take your money to run VMware on Amazon. Oh man, people on Twitter, they really get angry about this. There's a phrase they use. VMware Cloud is allowing the ongoing support of legacy end-of-life software, which is that's a fighting phrase right there. I'm not going to take a position on it, but so yeah, you can do that. You can just pick up and go over and drop down and go. That'll get you out of the data center. People have this conversation about it. Cloud's more expensive. I've run a cloud. One of my startups was actually build a cloud. I know the costs. Good luck. But so you can pick it up and move over and then maybe start peeling off the edges. But it definitely, for two reasons, you want to look at this from new technology, right? For your own career, for the folks out there who are like, my age or older or younger, I don't think it matters. If you want to keep going for a few more years, what tech are people using? This is something I do every few months. I just go and look, am I using the tech that I want to be using? Should I be dropping something and picking up something new? This laptop we're on today is a Apple Silicon. Up until a few months ago, I was on standard MacBook Pro, Intel. So look and change. I didn't get it when it first came out. I want to see what other people think, but I do the same thing with cloud. Do I want to go to Alley Cloud? Do I want to go maybe start one of the new concepts we have going around is people putting compute probably in Amazon. They've got fast storage, but then if you want a really great network, you go and you put that in Google. So different clouds have different sort of versions. If you want to do like fast databases or cheap databases, maybe put that in Oracle.
Yeah.
But since we're now microservice and cloud-based and API-based, and the networks are pretty damn reliable, not perfect, but pretty good, right, and pretty high speed, you can leave your API server in Amazon with doing your crunchy, then maybe have the database server on Oracle. Is that, in some cases, that'll totally make sense. So there's things you can look at, and not just on the security side, but it's worth sort of taking a step back every now and then. and thinking about,
Yeah.
am I doing things the best way?
Actually, that's an interesting point because I wonder how often people go back and look at, oh, actually, well, this is not really not going back, but looking forward for, hey, what else is going on, and what else? And I think I'm in a way glad you mentioned it for people who are trying to have like I guess a career for another 10, 15 years, maybe even longer, to keeping an eye, especially if you're in technology. It makes sense to keeping an eye out for what's out in the horizon. Which is kind of like the top topic of the month, like talking about cloud native, because how many people that I've spoken to are still probably don't have the opportunity to work with Kubernetes or any of the newer tech, or maybe even serverless. And you and I can talk about this, where Kubernetes has been there for some time already. It's not that it was released this year. It's been there for some time. It got massive adoption this year. There's another massive wave coming next year as well, I imagine. And so does some of the other cloud native projects. So in a way, I'm glad you mentioned, and I guess grateful to people who are listening and going, hey, what else is out there? So this makes me think of another set of people who probably are getting inspired by this and going around in their I guess architecture and looking, what kind of software do we have, or what kind of applications are we running? And they realize, hey, we already have cloud native. So and it's like it's one of those classic examples where maybe security was not called in. Someone swiped a credit card, moved to cloud, or maybe cloud native. And I think is an easier place to start tackling this problem. Like, I mean, I guess to your point, we have, I'm assuming this person maybe from a Monolith world, it has been on-premise for 25 plus years, and suddenly finds out, hey, there's AWS. Oh, okay, I'll just ask around questions like, oh yeah, we're using EKS, the Kubernetes service, whatever. I mean, you don't have, yeah, I know. It's like, so we're not specifically talking about the service, but the whole concept that, oh, actually, I discovered today that I'm in cloud native. What are some of the starting things that I should be looking at, which would be stark difference between like a on-premise world and a cloud native kind of world?
Yeah, I've been saying this a lot recently. I think I'm going to be saying it for a few years. I like to tease some of my friends over at Amazon. Guys, how do you keep up with the amount of products which Amazon is releasing, or do you? Because like I can't. There was a post which came out last week, just a single post. It's supposed to be one in a chain of 18 new controls which they're providing, security controls over Amazon products, and their intention to keep releasing these blog posts until they've got security controls across the whole fleet. And that's just security controls. And we're not talking about, I think it's about 180 products or some crazy number now. It's like,
I think it's touching 200 almost. Yeah.
I feel lucky in a way that I got into this beast early. Because I started just with Docker, right? And I did Docker and Docker Swarm for a few years. And then at some point I dipped my toe into the Kubernetes thing, and that's a whole separate world, right? For people out there who've done, what do we talk about? Cloud Stack, they've probably seen this sort of pattern before, and we'll probably see it again. But I think if I was going to answer that question, start with Docker on the desktop. Just keep it really simple. I think that's a container is enough like a VM or an operating system that for folks who've been around, it's pretty approachable and pretty understandable to understand what's going on in there. The previous CEO over at Docker had a phrase, Steve Singh, great phrase, which I've used so many times again, but additive collaboration. The idea, and I've done this in classes, right, where like, you help someone write a Docker compose file where you say, okay, download this MySQL container image from Docker Hub. Download, I don't know, let's talk about Node.js and not pick on Java. So a database plus Node, and let's write a little bit of JavaScript and put that in a file and have that mounted in and have those three things run and expose that on port 80 and then type Docker compose space up. And that simply, you've got a working web app, right? You didn't have to build or install or do anything with MySQL. Same with Node. You probably have to download some Node modules, right? But still, it's compared to a full, actually, if we had to do this 5-10 years ago on an EC2 instance, it's very quick to get going. And what's nice about that is not just that it's quick, but I know, at least for me, if I'm able to quickly see changes or see results from what I'm doing, it excites me. It makes me want to do more of that. So I think that's a great starting point. And then at some point, you're going to run into either networking issues or scaling issues. So then maybe start looking at Kubernetes, right? And that's sort of how you go up that path. But now let's talk about the security side of that thing. When you go out to Docker Hub, or when you go out and you're getting that MySQL container, let's talk about just going ahead and doing a container scan of it. So either, I believe now for free on the popular images, Docker will and display that vulnerability data. So you can see that, see what that looks like. You can go ahead and figure out, okay, is that something I need to patch? How would I go about patching it? And get a sense in there. Okay, you're back. I saw you disappear for a second. I was just going to keep talking until, either the half hour's up or until you came back.
No, that's fine.
So talking about, I think when you came in, I want to start talking from not just how do you get going in containers or Kubernetes, but let's go back and talk about the security side. So vulnerability scanning, right? That's our basis. What's going on, what's in there, what's installed, what's vulnerable. Download that container, figure out how to get a shell into it, look at what packages are installed, right? Pure OS thing. And then next you start thinking about, okay, well, how do I want that thing running? Maybe go and think about, okay, how can I control it? Is it going to run as root? What happens if someone can break out of that container? How would they? Okay, now they have control over my host. Can they see other stuff? So there's that aspect. And then you can think about firewalling that thing again. So it's, again, some of those sort of basic concepts. And that's probably, I like to learn project-wise personally. So either find a project, find something you're interested in. Usually when I'm at home, I have like some sort of IoT thing around. I'm like, get an IoT thing or a robot or something and create a weekend project and sort of play and see how this stuff works. But from someone doing it as part of their, day job, sitting at a desk, think about, we talked about those boxes. Think about how would you apply that to that MySQL MySQL node combination. Okay, if I want to put an IDS in this thing, how do I do it? If I want to do that in Kubernetes, how do I do it? If I want to do it in public cloud, right? So there's a concept so now the thing is, how do you take that concept and apply it to a new technology? So that's sort of the way I'd approach. And that's really what I do when I'm learning new languages myself. Right now we're using, in the past I've done, let's see, for IAC, infrastructure as code, I've used Puppet, I've used Chef, I've used Ansible, I've used Terraform, CloudFormation. So all these sort of beasts out there at the current company, CySense, we're looking at using Amazon CDK, cloud development kit.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty neat thing, right? But so as I said, I've done these things in other languages before. I've used the cloud. And usually what I'll do is I'll go through and sort of pointy-clicky figure out what my role should be between, say, the Lambda and a database to get that stuff to work. Okay, how do I turn that into code? Right. So, okay, I know the concepts. I know it's an IAM, or I know it's a security group, or I know I want to open a port or something like that. And it's pieces which I know about. But now how do I take that sort of part of my brain and apply it against a new language? So I think it's sort of the same for security people.
Oh, I love how you explained this, because I'm thinking about I guess going back to that individual's example, the persona that I just created out of thin air, coming from an on-premise world, you would already know some concepts. You already know networking. You already know how servers communicate. It's just about using that foundational piece to understand, hey, how does this work over in this context, whether it's Docker, Kubernetes, or whatever. There is still an identity. There is still a network. There's still someone who's talking, like either by network, it could even mean you need to have it on the internet. And it's even to the point that there's a one-to-one relationship between what we have spoken about before. I think I've got a question from Zenith over here as well, just quickly addressing that. Hey, Zenith. So speaking of patches, do you know why the AWS SSM Manager service doesn't wet patches? And if you know of situations in your career where it was caused you issues such as denial of service?
So I haven't used the patch management side of SSM. I'm familiar with it, know what it did. My previous company was Qualys, who, they're probably one of the first cloud-based vulnerability management companies. So I'm sort of familiar with the patch management space. And I don't have a direct answer. I'm going to bring an answer into that, but let's go back and talk about what I was just saying about vulnerability scanning of these containers. So I was talking about, go into Docker Hub, take a look at it. If you want a little more experience, maybe go out and get a copy of Claire or Trivy, which are both open source vulnerability scanners. Or go and put your container on Quay at Red Hat, or Amazon in their ECRs. You can look at. There's all sorts of ways to do this stuff. But what's sort of fun to bring up and talk about is if you scan, I don't know, let's say a Debian container. If you can find like a Debian version or Ubuntu version of MySQL, or what else? A few sort of more common, maybe like a HTTP not like an Alpine version, but like a version that has a full heavyweight container behind it.
Right.
So what you're seeing with containers, right? Container image, usually a version of Debian in a container is about 70 or 80 megabytes. But if you look at the slim, sorry, who am I kidding? Probably about 120, 150 megabytes. If you look at the slim version of it, it's probably about 30 to 50 megabytes. If you look at the Alpine Linux version, it's about 12. So there's reasons to use different versions of these same things. But if we look at the Debian or the Ubuntu version, it's probably going to say there's a vulnerability in PCRE, the Perl Regular Expression Library. That CVE, I want to say, is from 2017. And we're now in 2021 still. It's hard to keep track with this COVID and stuff. But so, okay, you're telling me about a vulnerability from 5 years ago. You're really going to tell me that hasn't been patched? So there's issues with some of these scanners, is what I'm saying. And that takes a little bit of common sense just to go through and talk that story. And I've seen it at a previous company. A junior engineer did the scan, it wasn't cleaning. There was security mandates that you have to be able to, be a certain level of security. So obviously that vulnerability has to be patched. The dude went and manually downloaded a version of PCRE and was compiling it and putting it into a container. I'm like, no, it's a false positive. No, right? But that takes some level of experience in this space to be able to recognize that and do it. And when I was at Qualys, man, I probably had that conversation with about 10 or 20 customers, not with our product, but like like I said, the open source scanners, they see this. It's hard to fix some of these signatures. So there's issues around patch management, all sorts of different ways. So the question comes down to having some level of experience about what's going on, what's it doing, what guardrails can you put in there? If anyone can put a patch into that system, the pattern I'll frequently talk about to people using Amazon is, okay, maybe you don't expose SSM directly for people to be uploading patches into, but you put some sort of a software package in front where they suggest a patch, and then you go and you vet it and sign it and then put it into the SSM system, right? So you have some level of control about what's going in there. And so that's sort of the trick around how to do some of that type of stuff. The DOS part, I haven't specifically seen in these use cases, but I mean, like, the one that's coming to mind right now, we had, was it McAfee AV? About 2-3 years ago, they released an update to their AV software on, I think it was for Dell systems, and it bricked the machines. So how's that for a DOS for you, right? These things are out there. It doesn't even have to be cloud-based. And it's, how do you, right? It really comes down to testing is the other side of that. So I talked to A about vetting and control and not just exposing that API out to anybody. But then on the second side, what things I really like about either containers or I'm using now with Amazon SAM for Lambda is being able to do sort of red-green deployments. So with that container thing, these things are so light and nimble and quick. When we go to release a new version of the product, maybe it has those patches in a new version. We updated the base container image because we wanted to get some vulnerabilities fixed. Okay, so instead of just rolling that out to, say, 100 hosts with 1,000 containers on it, let's roll it out to about 5%. And both Docker now and Kubernetes will let you do what's called a health check or define a health check. So basically, as part of that container coming up, wait until a HTTP gets to some URL, returns a thumbs up or some sort of positive value. If you see that, okay, the application's up and running, then you can go ahead and roll it out to the rest of your containers. If you didn't see that, hey, maybe we want to roll back and double check and see what's going on. So there's ways to do some of these tests around this type of stuff.
Actually, you've kind of touched upon really interesting things from an architecture perspective as well. And by the way, that's a great question, Zenith, as well, because I think as I'm kind of listening to John, your answer, I'm going, oh, wow, okay, you're right. Because we used to do this in on-premise where we would have a strategy for patch management. You don't directly get everything. There is a testing phase, and then it gets released out to everyone. It's like that push button thing. And we can still have that same model in cloud and cloud native kind of applications as well. And to your point about the other one that you mentioned from a patching perspective was the whole blue-green thing. That was you can have a small set of servers, but use cloud native services and I think what you're trying to get to as well, you can still have them automate that through thousands of servers, but almost still have like that testing foundation done, especially if you're dealing in a monolith. Because I think that the model that AWS kind of talks about, hey, you don't have to worry about patches, we take care of everything. But even in that scenario, RDSs, I'm using as an example, the databases, they've asked us to have a maintenance window, which we should be completely okay with, to have them patch our servers and hopefully bring that back on time. And this is a database. So I imagine how important that would be for any company out there. So even I haven't actually heard of a denial service in that case, but I think to your point, it's always, I guess, moving to cloud, the model should always be that, hey, I should be able to test this. And I like a blue-green, if you want to use that as an example, I should be able to blue-green this. And the whole immutable architecture that people talk about, where it's decoupled, you're going back to your shopping cart example, just because your inventory is failing doesn't really mean your shopping cart should fail, because you still want the customer to be able to go and fully complete the transaction of the inventory that they have already added to their cart. So
Yeah.
I think such a
And
different way of thinking.
Yeah, and that blue-green thing, I'm not just dreaming that up. That's literally built into Kubernetes. That's the way we do modern deployments. You can say, hey, once X percentage is reporting positive health, go ahead and roll it out to the rest. That's an automation. That might take us a little bit to, excuse me, that's something sort of new and something we have to figure out the first time that, we've never done that in the past, right, on desktops. Well, maybe you might, what, I guess the way I would have done it was I'd patch my system, but I definitely wasn't patching my boss's system. So, right, you do that type of thing and make sure things are fine. And then once you sort of lose it for a few days, things are good, then you go and roll out. But now it's part of the concept, which is really great.
Yeah. I think it's pretty good as well that, by the way, I'm just want to kudos to Zenith and others as well who are thinking of using services which are cloud service. I mean, I guess because that kind of forces you to kind of go into a direction where you have to decide on, hey, how do I automate this so I don't have to look after patching for thousands of servers. So I think kudos to you for doing that as well, Zenith. While we've been talking about the patching as well, and we were talking about the Monolith application, actually, that made me think about from perspective that the whole DevSecops thing that people talk about, right? Because I feel like now the industry is kind of like three big buckets. I mean, I'm sure there are SOC and everything else in there, but people are primarily talking about cloud security, application security, and as people talk about application security, because everyone's going serverless, so application security is a lot more bigger bubble than what it used to be, and now going, hey, how do I do DevSecOps and all this, right? Because I think I'm sure there's a DevSecOps fan out there listening, and yes, we should do DevSecOps. Is that even a thing for a monolith application, or is it only after it moves into a cloud?
Let's drag the nails on the chalkboard a little bit for a second and try to call it DevOps and see who sort of erupts at us. And by the way, folks, we've got about, 10, 12 minutes left in here. We love questions. Keep them coming. I love, we've got stuff we can talk about. We can talk all day, but give us questions, what's in your mind. That's what makes us fun and interesting.
Yep.
So DevSecOps, just think about the DevOps part of it for a second. When we're talking about those monoliths, if we're looking at hundreds of thousands of lines of code, those things frequently, the build cycle, you're looking at hours from the time you type make and go off to grab your coffee or lunch before that thing's actually done. And the reason I mention this is if you're in a modern CI process where, let's talk about modern CIs. I throw these buzzwords around. I'll use GitHub as an example. So every time when I check in code or do a code push, I'm going to push into a branch because I'm not allowed to push to the main code tree. And then in that, I've got GitHub Actions or GitHub rules set up. So when it sees that new code come in, it's going to try and compile it. Let's make sure the damn thing compiles. We're going to lint it to make sure that, we're following best practices, both code-wise as well as, no outstanding like hard-coded passwords and stuff like that. If we're a little more advanced as we go through this maturity process, we might have let's do some static analysis, see if there's any obvious SQL injections or things like that. Maybe go a little bit further and do like an actual integration test. Can we actually run some unit tests against it, make sure that a standard suite of code tests work and we maintain, say, 75, 80% test code coverage. So these are the type of things I talk about when I say this. And then once that's done and goes green, we can click a button, have it merge into our main branch, and then I can click another button and have that bad boy automatically shot over to Amazon Lambda or ECS or let's see, EKS, or you get the idea. Either two containers or serverless. But that's just clicks, right? And if I have full trust, once that code is merged, I can have it run that automatically. So this is what gets us these very updated, very quick things, right? If I see a bug in a bit of code, could be either a typo on a site or I want to change some color or something, and I can do that little process I talked about from check out the code, open a bug, modify a few lines of code, go ahead and commit and push it with that bug ID, goes in, it goes through a CI process. Maybe that takes 4 or 5 minutes. I merge it, and it goes out. We've done probably multiple code releases during us talking here over the last 45 minutes. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about modern CI. So back to that monolith bad boy. Let's see. So the compile would probably take, like I said, in some cases, at least half an hour, if not an hour. That might time out in GitHub, but you can probably pay for more resources, or you can have your test run on Amazon. But that's just the compile. Now, if I want to go through do the static analysis, that's basically another compile. So in that previous life, when I was doing pen testing and code review, I used to use a lot of Fortify SCA, and for him to test a large code base, it was another go and grab a coffee or lunch. So I've grabbed, let's see, breakfast for just doing the compile. I had to grab lunch to do the Fortify scan. And then there's probably some other process, and there's probably going to be at least dinner, right? So you can do Devsecops, and that might be a good way to start, right? It's just let's have the code be built every time or scanned every time we go through this process. But you're going to have a lot of pain, right? And maybe it'll give you the chance to see how the stuff works and get some of these pieces in place, and then give you a really great use case of, hey man, I've got to spin up an EC2 instance that runs for 3 hours to compile my code. That's an EC2 M4 extra large, which probably costs about $4 or $5 an hour. I'm making this up. What's wrong with me? So that means every time I go to compile my code, it's costing about $5 to $10.
Yep.
You go back and tell your boss that, you suddenly have a pretty good use case to go and actually start peeling off some of these microservices, right? So that's how you go about some of these things, depending on where you are in the organization.
Yeah, I think I love the example as well, and kind of the way you mapped out the amount of time it would take to deploy it. Yeah, probably one of the reasons why a lot of people wanted to move across as well. And I think I feel like we may have gotten people a lot of excitement with hey, this is a lot of stuff to get used to or learn from. Is there? I actually don't know if there's anything that you can learn about Monolith. No one really talks about Monolith as a thing. So are there maybe let's start with what's a mature migration, or I guess successful migration, if you want to call it. In your mind, what's a mature migrated monolith in a cloud or cloud native world look like? And we'll probably take it from there. So what does that look like when people have successfully moved it across?
I'm pragmatist, so I'm not going to say that let's call it 100, let's call it 1 million lines of code. I mean, you could say the end story is no functions with more than 1,500 lines of code. I don't want to go that way. Let's look at this pragmatically. Which parts of your application are you, the way you go about peeling those onion layers off is, which part am I changing a lot? Which part do we need to modify or bring in some new code? Maybe it's, you need to start talking to a third-party API, or maybe you need to expose an API and you don't want to expose an API for a whole app. Excuse me. There's reasons you could do this. But let's go from that point of view. This is what Adrian talks through in that video. So the next one would be, okay, we got that most important one. We've got that to a microservice, so we can update it quickly without waiting the day each time. And then find the next one and next one and next one. At some point, you're going to realize that whatever's left in that monolith, we haven't had to touch that code for 2 or 3 weeks. And maybe it's still at this point 500,000 lines of code or 700,000 lines of code. But whatever that guy's doing, he's just doing it. And that's like a little more legacy. We don't have to update it. We can update the stuff around the edge. So that to me is how I would look at something like this, right? Have the big piece of code run on an EC2 instance, like I said, and put your more modern stuff into serverless. So one of the things we've been thinking about and talking through at my current place is how do we go about, where do we want to use serverless versus a container, right? Do I like I said, I don't want to run Kubernetes unless I have to. I love it, I know it, but if I don't have to spin that thing up, let's keep it away. So in a Lambda instance for us, you can have a Lambda that'll run up to 15 minutes. Default the timeout is 5 minutes, but it's probably going to be a function, right? So it's going to be doing a specific thing for me. What would be an example? If someone posts something on an S3 bucket, it'll grab a copy of that and do crunchy and then store it in a database. So right, that's a very specific task. But then maybe the next thing, maybe if I'm going to run a scan against a large cloud instance, I know it's going to take more than 15 minutes. So let's put that into a container, right? So the container's sitting there, he's listening to a message queue. The Lambda instance sees the incoming request for the scan. He puts something onto the message queue. The container sees it, grabs it, spends the next 30, 40 minutes doing the scan, puts something into S3 bucket, another Lambda grabs it, does the crunchy back into a database. We're starting to build up a picture here, right? So this is sort of the way I think about it. And at some point, maybe, what are mainframes good at? They're really great at crunching really huge amounts of data. So maybe we do our quarterly reports are still done on the mainframe, and he just sits there and once a month we go and we download all the data from the RDS database at Amazon into our local DB2. I'm sure I'm giving someone out there some sort of post-traumatic stress. I'm really sorry about that. But, some of these things still need to be done. And I think that's sort of how I think about it, right? Is don't be looking to move everything. Look to keep your eyes at what's my prize? What am I trying to do? I'm not just using technology for the sake of it. There's a reason we're doing this. So what is that? And let's make sure we set the bounds around what that is. So that's how I think of it.
Oh, I love the answer. And I think so I was talking to someone about this recently as well. And he introduced me to the concept of cost of delay. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a whole idea. Sorry?
Oh, I haven't, but keep going.
Oh, yeah. So the cost of delay was really interesting. What they spoke about was that the time you would spend as an organization to, say, uplift something, which to your point, let's just use a mainframe example, which have been crunching numbers for so many years. The time spent to replace mainframe with, say, a serverless or something else, is that really time worth giving an advantage to a competitor just because you wanted to uplift the code? Yes, you feel really happy that you've uplifted or monolithic code to, say, something really modern. You can do blue-green and everything. But what's the point when you've lost to the customer or you've lost to the competition? So it's about finding that balance as well. I think that's probably a great way to kind of come to the kind of like a close as well. But that's probably one of my it's going to be a highlight for me for this one. Is there like an education thing that you can talk about as well, where if people are listening to this and going, hey, where do I learn about this stuff? Is there something that you know of which you can probably direct people to as well?
Yeah, so there's a few different ones. I think I'll give you a link for one of Adrian's Cockcroft's talks about this. How you peel the onion layers off. I think that's. It's 10 years later, I'm still talking about that talk, so it's got to be a good talk. That's a great place. Yeah. As you're getting interested in cloud security, I'd say two things: Cloud Security Alliance. I've helped write some of the earlier versions of their how to use cloud securely. I'm still active in some of their work groups over there. They've got a ton of different work groups and research areas, and also people not just for learning. If you want to get involved and help with these things, people of all levels, please, will take. And then the third one I'd say would be CNCF. We've got like I said, this group called Tag Security, a technical advisory group for security. Come in, ask questions. We're on Slack. We've got weekly meetings. If you're trying to figure out how to secure something, or you think you see a bug, or you want help with documentation, again, any open source project will take help of any level. So I think that's how I'd suggest that to people.
Awesome. That's a great way. And I think what I'll do is I'll probably, I think if people have questions, I'm going to come back as well later, because it's going to be on live on YouTube after this. So it's going to drop questions as well, or as comments. That'll be awesome as well. I do have one last section that I go through with people. It's a fun section. It's just 3 questions. So it'll be super quick, hopefully. And this is just to get John a little better outside of technology, I guess. The first question is, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on cloud and cloud native and technology in general?
Give you 2 things. Cooking. I love to cook.
When
I first came down to Silicon Valley, I was actually going to make my millions and then go open a restaurant. I read Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential and decided that was a horrible idea. And if I'm not doing that, I like to do things with my hands. So I'm also a lot of woodworking. But if not those 2, I'm out on a bike. So.
Awesome. I need to get some cooking lessons for you, especially helpful with the lockdowns, I guess. The second question, what is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
Ooh. Proud of, but not on my social media. On woodworking here, I've like working my hands. I've just finished a what's called a Nakamiji style live edge walnut table. That's about let's see if I talk metric. It's about 2.5 meters long by about 1.5 meters wide. So it's this very big, probably about 500-pound table, dining room table.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm pretty proud of that. They'll probably go out into Reddit in the next month or 2 once I get it set up. And so that's sort of.
Wait, you did that yourself on your own?
Yeah. So
Wow.
I bought the walnut came as 2 slabs and 1/2. So basically, how do you glue those things together? How do you flatten them? How do you fill in all the gaps and make sure it's not going to crack or things like that in the future? And yeah,
It's really interesting. I'm finding like a lot of technology people are going towards more creative things, or was more like handiwork kind of things as well. As people kind of like, there's enough technology just writing softwares, but something doing with your hand has its own, I guess, charm to it. I guess, for lack of a better
it,
word.
it's gratifying, right? To actually see something. So in woodworking, for me, one of the most amazing moments is when you have something finished and sanded, and you put that first coat of finish on it, whether it's an oil or a stain, and like the wood just pops and comes alive, and you're like, wow, this thing I've been looking at under sawdust and scraps of wood for months is like, that's actually something beautiful. So yeah, it's a really cool thing to do.
Awesome. And one last question, because it's probably best as well because you're into cooking. What's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share with us?
Favorite restaurant would be Alinea in Chicago. I got to go there many years ago. It's a really great place. Probably one of the best in the U.S. If I had to pick a style of food, I can eat sushi for weeks.
Okay. I think I'll be the same as well. I think it's funny to the comment about me about talking about technology and people looking for creative stuff. I just want to give shout out to Zenith because she's written a children's book as well, so people should definitely check her out. So it was top 10 in Amazon as well. And coming from a cybersecurity background, writing a book about like a children's book, so giving a shout out to you as well, Zenith. That's pretty much what we had time for. And where can people find you on social media?
Easiest is Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn out there as well, but Twitter is sort of my sort of the more fun stuff, hopefully. John L. Kinsella. You'll probably see in the notes. Yeah, feel free to say hi. I'm on Instagram as well, but that's more sort of less techie type stuff.
That's more woodwork, I imagine.
Yeah, cooking, food porn.
Awesome. But I really enjoyed this session because I think I'm so glad we touched on the monolith topic as well. And thank you to everyone who watched and basically came up with the questions as well, because I think it's always interesting to kind of hear what other people have to say. If you did not get to see this live and you're watching this later on, feel free to drop a comment. And oh, wow. Actually, Zenith is #1 bestseller. There you go. On Amazon,
Woo-hoo.
I think. Congratulations, Zenith. That's pretty awesome. So people should definitely check out the children's book. I think it's pretty awesome. So there you go. But yeah, if you are tuning into this after the live, feel free to drop a comment, and I'm sure I can get that to John. But this has been really fun for me, and I'm looking forward to having you again, John. Thanks for coming in.
I'd love to. Thank you. Take care and stay safe.
Thanks.